Hi, this is Whitney, aka Shapespeare on the Thingiverse, and welcome to Blender Basics for 3D Printing Part 2. As we can see, I've imported an STL file into Blender. This is a Sense 3D scan of my youngest daughter, and we're going to prepare this for 3D printing. So, the first thing we want to do is look at the size. Since the Sense scanner scans things at full size, this is a little bit too big to print on most printers. What I like to do, particularly with human scans like this, is to scale them to a known value. In this case, I'm going to scale it to 0.25. That's to say 25% of life size. Okay, now we notice that the model here is not centered on the origin, which is kind of annoying. If you import this into your slicer software, the model could end up outside the build volume and you'll have to readjust it. So it's just neater to put it on the origin. Very easy to do. We go to Object, Transform, Geometry to Origin, and that puts it right in the middle, right on the origin. Okay? Now, we're going to take this opportunity to straighten things out a little bit. We hit R to rotate. Make sure she's standing up straight. A lot of times these scans come in sort of crooked depending on how you're holding the scanner. And this is looking pretty good. So we have our model straightened out nicely. Now, another problem that we're going to have here is that there's no flat bottom on this model. There's nothing to rest on the build plate. If you were sending it off to Shapeways to be printed, that might not be such a problem. But most printers that hobbyists have these days can't deal with a model that doesn't have a flat bottom. But never fear, it's easy enough for us to fix. So I'm going to put us in a little bit of a perspective view here, so that we can see what happens when we add a plane to our model. Okay? Now, when you add an object, you get this menu that pops up over here, and once you move that object, this menu goes away and it never comes back. So it's best to adjust things before you actually do any movement on them. So we're going to set this plane to a radius of 100, which looks about right. Okay? Now, if we select by left-clicking on our model, and these arrows here allow us to move it in only one direction at a time. So in this case, we want to move it only in the Z direction. So we're going to hold the Z arrow down and line it up on that plane so it looks nice. We want to make sure that we're getting all that printing artifact stuff cut off on the bottom. This plane is going to become a cutting edge for us. So we want to get her lined up just right. That looks pretty good. Okay. Now, with our model selected, we go over here on the right-hand side and click the little wrench. That's the modifier menu. And we say Add Modifier, Boolean modifier, select difference, and the object plane. So the Boolean modifiers basically are math problems. They take one object and either add or subtract it from another object. In this case, we're saying take everything that's above the plane and keep it, and subtract away everything that's below the plane. Okay? And that looks pretty good, so we're going to click to apply that. You don't have to apply modifiers. You can leave them dangling there, and that works pretty well with smaller objects. If you're doing a relatively simple model and you want to add a modifier, you don't have to apply it immediately. With a large model like this, rather, if you have a modifier that you haven't applied, every time you move anything in this object, it has to recalculate the modifier. And if it takes a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes to calculate the modifier, that gets annoying really fast, because every time you move your model like this, then it has to recalculate the modifier. So best to just apply it, and we're done there. Okay, now if we look at our model again, we notice that she's sitting nice and flat on the origin, sitting straight up and down, and is scaled to a scale that will fit on our printer. Before we export this model, let's look at some of the details here. First of all, I'm going to turn off that plane. This is called the outliner view, which defaults to being in your upper right hand corner, and it shows you all the objects in your scene here. In this case, I'm going to click on the eyeball right next to the plane, and that'll turn that off. It's still there. If I need it later, I can bring it back, but I don't need to look at it all the time. Now, since this is a sense scan, there's a few artifacts on it, and you can notice under the chin here, there's some kind of weird artifacty stuff from the scan. So I want to fix that before I print it, because I don't want to see that in my final print. So I'm going to go down here. We've been working in object mode so far. If we go into sculpt mode and select the smoothing brush, and then we can just smooth away all that scanning artifact. Very handy to do for retouching things. There's a whole bunch of different tools here. You really got to just play with them and learn what they do. The ones that I use the most are the smoothing brush and the inflate deflate. Are generally the most useful things, at least for 3D printing. After we've smoothed all that over, then we can go out of sculpt mode and back into object mode. And there you have it. Now, it's worth noting that object mode is sort of how you deal with a whole object. You know, if you want to work on a whole object at any given time, if you want to resize it or move its position relative to other objects. If you want to deal with parts of an object, from object mode, you go to edit mode, and this shows you the actual mesh. So right now, it's bright orange because they're all selected, but if we hit A to deselect, and if we zoom in enough, you can see that is the mesh that we're working on. You can see all the individual vertices. And one of the things I like a lot about Blender, which you don't see in a lot of other software for 3D, that's used for 3D printing at least, is that we can actually modify any of these individual vertices that we want. You don't often get in there at that granular a level, but it's possible to do it if you want to. Useful to know that is an option in Blender, which most other software packages for 3D rendering or for 3D printing at least don't offer you that. I'll show you one more tip while we're here. You notice that there's a little floating bit here, for instance. That happens a lot with scans, particularly in hair. So we're going to go into edit mode. And you can see we have our mesh there. Now we're going to click somewhere on the main mesh. And now we have just selected one vertex. In fact, if you look up here, you can see we have one of 172,749 vertices is selected. We're going to hit Control L. That's Control L for select linked faces. And then we're going to go Control I to invert that selection. Okay. Now if we pan around here, you can see there's a few things that are still glowing orange. Those are three little things which are not connected to our main model. Okay? So particularly when you're dealing with scans, that's an important thing to be aware of. If you just have a couple of little ones floating around, your slicer will probably ignore them. Most slicers will, at least. And even if they don't, you're not going to be extruding enough extra plastic to really make a difference on that sort of thing. But it's easy enough after we've selected them. Hit delete and say we're going to delete the vertexes. And then from edit mode, we'll go back into object mode. You can do that, by the way, with the tab key. Will take you between edit mode and object mode. And let's take one last look at our model. And I think it's ready to be exported as an STL and then printed.